Hi, and welcome to the Long View. My name is Dave Danielson, and with me is Bill Greiner. And we're going to be discussing PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and this is called Phase 4. If you've been following, you've probably noticed that there was a Phase 1, which we covered in depth, Bill covered in depth. Phase 2, which was some additional funds that were available. We really don't know what happened to Phase 3. But we're in Phase 4 now, and there is more money to be had. So the first question I'm going to ask Bill this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, is what is the Paycheck Protection Program now as it goes into Phase 4?
So Dave, thanks. So we've had two rounds of PPP. Again, I'm not sure why we're calling the next thing that we're going to talk about PPP4, but the first round was successful. Within less than 2 weeks, all that money was used up by small businesses and nonprofits across the country. They replenished funds through Congress a couple of weeks later, what we called PPP Round 2. And there was about $330 billion that was allocated for PPP. And the bill was a little bigger than that, but there was some money in there for a couple of other SBA programs. And as of now, there's over 120 billion that has not been used from that. So you could say a couple hundred billion has been used and 100+ billion has not been used. And that program PPP2 has been ongoing for several weeks now. So what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis is a very small trickle of demand. And the average loan in PPP2 was about 50% smaller than the average in PPP1. So the bigger companies that may have been a little more connected through CPAs or through banks or through lawyers or business advisors kind of got in there first, and that was first come first serve. It shut down. So now in the second round, you still had some bigger companies, but a lot more of the real small entrepreneurs, were involved in this round. And at the very end of PPP1, the allowance was made to have sole proprietors, independent contractors, self-employed people participate. Almost none of those folks made it through round 1 because the approval came as the money was running out. So that's why the average loan is a lot smaller. You're seeing a lot of those loans, which for an independent person, they're capped at $20,800. So that you can't have big loans if you're a self-employed individual, regardless of what your income might have been or that you're capped. So those loans are much smaller in this round, which is why it's taking a longer time to run through that money. And I think the sense in Washington right now is that based on the criteria that exists for PPP, they're probably not going to run out with that money, of that money. It doesn't mean that people don't need more money. It just means that under PPP, any business that was a qualifying business could use 2.5 times average monthly payroll and apply for a loan. If you've done it, you've done it, period. It doesn't matter whether you're open for business or not open for business. The law only allows you to apply once. And that's a result is you've got a bunch of money that may be useful to businesses, but under the current law, you can only apply once. And that's why it's going out of a trickle at this point. Most people that needed it have done their one application. And it's pretty much at a standstill at this point in terms of demand.
So how will this new program help, Bill?
So what's being proposed now, and I've seen draft legislation. Last Wednesday, I got it from Senator Shaheen's office. So Senator Shaheen is a very important member of the Senate Small Business Committee, and she had her self heavily involved in PPP1, PPP2, and they've taken a lead on getting additional monies for businesses that had taken that money in round 1, whose money's run out. And I mean, as we are doing this show right now, there are many businesses across this country, and particularly New Hampshire, that no longer have PPP money. Yet they may, in the case of restaurants, only be allowed to have 50% occupancy. And I can tell you from in that industry, you lose money when you're at 50% occupancy. There are retailers that are capped at 50%, like haircutting places, and just regular retailers. I was down at the Merrimack outlets the other day, and they count how many people go into a store, and when they hit a certain number, that's it. Until somebody comes out, nobody else goes in. So we're reopening, but again, on a limited basis. And it's not necessarily, you don't make money just because you're open if you're only open in a smaller capacity. So the concern that a lot of business people voiced is that those who took that first round PPP money are at a little bit of a disadvantage because they either didn't lay anybody off or they brought people back off the unemployment rolls in early April. You had 8 weeks of money and that's gone. If you were a PPP round 2 person, you most likely laid your people off. We all saw that spike in unemployment, Dave, and they didn't bring those people back on until they got approved. Well, that was about, on average, about a month later. And so if you're a PPP round 1 restaurant, let's say as an example, in New Hampshire, your money ran out the day that you were able to open at a 50% capacity. The restaurant owner that took round 2 PPP money still has another 4 weeks left. And so they will get to July, into early July before they run out. And by that time, hopefully the state's in a phase 3, which means you can be at 100% capacity. So the phase 1 businesses many of them are struggling right now. Do they lay their employees off? What do they do? Because it's not that the rules are unfair or different. It's just the timing of things was different. And so the thought was, can you get some additional PPP money to the first rounders? And the proposal that's out there in draft legislation is 4 weeks. So again, it just gets us anybody in first round to early July to where we should be in a better position. And that's not just in New Hampshire, but nationally. Some states have opened earlier, some haven't. And that legislation is not completed, but it's fairly complete. And I'm happy to go through some of the particulars in there, who would qualify, who might not qualify. What are the senators thinking that have crafted this thing? And it's a bipartisan effort, Dave, that really spans the country in terms of who the senators
I think that would be helpful, Bill. And if I could just, in my own mind, it sounded like what we're headed into is this what we're calling PPP4 is really PPP 1A.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's just say a business got $100,000 in round 1.
Right.
They would be, if this thing becomes law, PPP4 becomes law, they would be able to get $50,000. So half of what they got. So instead of the 8 weeks, it's 4. And it's simple. And I've actually corresponded with folks on the Small Business Committee in the Senate because they want to make sure from a banking perspective it's easy. And the fact is it is easy because a person or a business has already applied all of that data to determine that 2.5 time monthly payroll formula is already in the bank's hands. And so it's very easy to go get a second loan for those first round people because the banks don't have to start all over again. They have the data. The data allowed them to get a loan worth X in the first round. So now you're just trying to get a loan that's half that size. So it should be a very seamless, quick and easy process.
Okay. And if I could run to the end of it so we can come back, I want to talk about what you feel are the qualifications for it. But if we can run to the end, so the forgiveness rules will probably be the same.
Yes,
for this.
Everything will be the same. Excellent. The only difference in this is who would be eligible and how much of a multiple of the monthly payroll you're talking about.
Okay,
that's
so
really all it is.
Let's talk about who will be eligible now in this next week, especially with New Hampshire. A view on New Hampshire.
Sure. So it started out as something that would be first round PPP recipients. And again, as I mentioned before, that's because the timing is such that the money runs out about a month earlier than the second round people. And, the analogy is if you get tackled on the 15-yard line, you can't score. It's fourth down, it's done. Whereas the other folks get in there, and it's not because they're any faster or they have a better team. It's just where they got the ball to begin with, and they got the ball closer to the goal line. And so that was the thought. So who would be the ones qualifying? One, it's people that got first round money. Initially, this was discussed as a fix for restaurants and hotels nationally because in many states, hotels are still closed. Restaurants are at various stages of occupancy. Most are 50% or less. And again, that's, as I mentioned, that it doesn't work. As time goes on, that occupancy should change. And that would have cost about 15 billion. So in round one, $30 billion was allocated to all restaurant, food, and hotel establishments in the country. And that initially got pretty good traction with Senator Shaheen, Senator Rubio, Senator Graham, and I have spoken to all three of them personally multiple times. So they all get this. Senator Rubio and Senator Graham hear this in their state. Obviously, Senator Shaheen hears it in New Hampshire quite a bit. Senator Cardin, who is the ranking member, so Senator Rubio is the chair of that committee. Senator Cardin is the ranking member of the committee from Maryland. He felt that it should be expanded to any first round business. So forget industries based on certain needs. And so in other words, it wouldn't be just take that full $330+ billion from round one, divide it by 2, and that's your number. It'd be a smaller number than that. And the number would be based on eligibility. Eligibility meaning you have to have 100 or fewer employees if you're a restaurant or hotel per location. That's number one. Number two, your revenue has to be down 50% on average in the quarter versus a quarter, last year. So it shows that you're impacted and you're not open. And those were the two main sticking points, to who would qualify, who wouldn't. The third one was you couldn't take more than 2 million in this loan round. So if you got 5 million last round, the most you could get applied for is 2 million in this round in the aggregate. So if you had several companies if you're a restaurant owner and you have 10 Dunkin' Donuts, you get 10 loans because they're different LLCs. Well, the way that the language is crafted is that all 10 could not total more than 2 million in aggregate. Again, trying to hit the small businesses. I have heard of only a few potential changes to that, one being maybe 150 full-time employees in a location. But other than that, I'm still hearing it's geared towards small businesses, first-round people, and you have to have either a revenue loss of 50% or your business is 50% or less in terms of who you can serve. So if you're a small hairstyle salon in Nashua, New Hampshire, and you're able to serve at 50% occupancy, you would qualify. If you're at 3/4, you wouldn't qualify. So that's what's potentially being tweaked: revenue versus what your capacity could be. You have had Senators Ernst from Iowa. She's very interested in this legislation. Senator Collins from Maine, very interested in this legislation. Cory Gardner, senator from Colorado, very interested in this legislation, very supportive. You have Chris Combs, Democratic senator from Delaware. So you really have bipartisan work going on in this. And, it's been fascinating because I've been working on this behind the scenes with, another individual, another business owner, and to watch how this gets done legislatively, in trying to bring a coalition together, starting with one Democrat, then you grab a Republican, then you try to grab another Republican, then a Democrat. You need to have bipartisan support. That's why PPP has been so successful, Dave. As you know, it's passed unanimously each time. This is a universal issue. As much as we know it hurts New Hampshire, it hurts every other state too. What's going on in terms of business shutdown and how the pandemic is affecting businesses. So it's really a bipartisan effort, and I think we're pretty far along in this process. I would expect a vote to come on this, pretty quickly. The money's run out, and that's the issue.
Given what you know about how, and it sounds pretty positive from what you've said, would you suspect that this bill then will be passed?
I do.
Okay.
I would. So one of the other angles that we took initially was knowing that this money was sitting there fairly stagnant in this PPP 2 bucket. There was $120+ billion. Yep. Is when we were originally talking about the hotel and the restaurant industries, that's a $15 billion number. So the proposal that I pushed out to all of these senators we just talked about was shift that money, pass a law that shifts that money to the round one people. So you wouldn't have to appropriate any more money. You wouldn't have to allocate any more money. You're just shift, from the treasury, you're shifting money from one bucket 2 to bucket 4 or bucket 1.5, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Or 1A, and it's a simple number. frankly, even with the broader parameters that I just laid out to you, that it's any round one business, as long as you meet certain criteria, and knowing that it's only half of what it could have been before, at most 4 weeks, I think there's enough money that's already in the system. That said, I think Senator Cardin would like to see new monies put in. I think Senators Rubio and Shaheen and others think that there's using the existing bucket is fine. So that it doesn't really matter. The most important thing is to get the money put out there. So that's one thing that they'll probably debate a little bit in DC is, do you use the money that's there or not? Clearly, the desire of everybody in DC that I've spoken to is to make sure that there is enough money. So if more money is needed because we do get a spike in a second wave or things drag on, you've got to continue to help these businesses. Otherwise, if you don't, then all this money you spent is for nothing. And if you think about it, use a restaurant as an example. If a restaurant can't open in Massachusetts, they can't open up, and they had round one PPP money, and they've spent it to retain their employees, do they lay their employees back off on unemployment? If they do that, they can do that. Number one, it was a waste of time and effort on PPP. That money's flushed. Number two, it will actually cost the government more money, because when you pay unemployment to somebody, you don't get the Social Security and the Medicare tax back. At least when you're paying them on the private payroll, there are those taxes that at least come back into the system.
Right.
And I think that's important. One way or another, the government will pay for these individuals. They will either pay for them if they are relayed off, or they will pay through them through additional funding in PPP. So it's not a matter of should we spend money or should we not spend money. That debate's done. It's how do we spend the money?
Right. I know I have two questions, an observation and one question. An observation is to what you just spoke to. You and I had spoken, I think, on the first go around. I remember asking you, saying, Bill, where is this money coming from? And I remember you looking right at me and saying, Dave, we're going to pay for this. It's going to be in taxes. Mm-hmm. At some point in time, either us or our families are going to be paying for this in the future. And it's the time, I'm sure people talked about this in the 30s when they were going through all of that change in the economic world. So we're just going to have to deal with this when it comes up. However, my question was, I have heard hearsay, but I've also read in some cases that a lot of the smaller companies, and I'm speaking specifically in New Hampshire, a lot of the smaller companies have not participated. A lot of the not-for-profits have not participated in the program. In some of the businesses I'm familiar with, the arts world, they've not participated. Why? Has it been not promoted well? First of all, is that a correct assumption? And then if it is, why do you think that might be?
That's a good question. So I would tell you that there was some discussion that a lot of people were sitting on the sidelines nationally and not taking money because there was so much uncertainty of the rules, and there have been dozens of changes and reflections to the rules. And once that happened, you'd see a bunch of people pour in for the money. The fact is that hasn't proven to be the case at all. And in talking to other banks, and with the New Hampshire Bankers Association, did an informal poll, and virtually all of the banks have said that they believe that everybody that needed them got them, and that there is not a line of people that could come in. Now, take that aside. Are there people that have not gotten PPP money? The answer is yes. Why? One, not every bank is doing this, and I'm not going to name those banks, but I will tell you that there are some banks that did not participate in round two. They just chose not to. And we had, at Primary Bank, we received a call from another competitive bank, not going to name a name, that asked us if we would do PPP loans for their customers. Bizarre, but it happened. And the loans in this round are much smaller. The fees are less. Some of the bigger banks may not want to deal with it, which is unfortunate, and that's a different discussion for a different day. And so their customers, in some cases, have been shut out or find it too rigorous of a process. And so sometimes they might give up, Dave. Sometimes they they may shop and try to find a bank that they don't have a relationship with, and some banks will only do them with existing customers.
Sure.
And so I think there's a subset of people and businesses out there that want it that do not have it today. And I think the part of it has to do with potentially the bank that they bank with. Part of it may be education, but I think a lot of people understand what PPP is in general. And some people might not think they qualify, and that's just a matter of talking to your CPA, talking to your attorney, talking to your banker, and ask, do you qualify? And I think if anybody searches hard enough, they'll find somebody, but it may not be the first door that you knock on that will be the institution, the bank, the credit union that gives you that PPP money or makes that process happen for you.
You may not.
One more thing, as far as nonprofits.
I'm sorry.
I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples. The Courier Museum did get PPP money, and I know that because we bank them at Primary Bank, and we got them PPP money. I will tell you, I talked to a friend of mine who's on the board of directors of Easter Seals. They did not get PPP money. And the reason they didn't is they were too big. They didn't qualify for it. And so there has been talk about getting more money to nonprofits. There's been talk about relaxing that rule because they're as impact as anybody else. And a lot of what they have relies on donations, which becomes a compounding effect as the economy goes south. So I can speak for folks that we bank. We have banked some nonprofits, but again, I can give you an example of one that just didn't qualify, and they would love to have gotten PPP money. They just did not meet the employee threshold. They were too many people.
Okay. All of that is informative, I think. One of the questions I had that was coming out of that was, do you think the industries themselves, and I'm thinking the arts industries, I mean, you mentioned the museum,
Mm-hmm.
do you think the industries themselves are promoting it internally?
No, I should say no. It depends. So okay. I would think that there are some that are probably not as organized, if you will.
That's good.
That are probably not on top of it. The Restaurant Association was very much on top of it, and they would tell folks, restaurant owner X, if you can't get it at your bank, here are a list of banks that are doing them. Call them. Here's some contacts. So they were trying to be proactive to save the restaurants. So to answer your question, I think that it's yes and no. Some groups, some organizations, some industries are on top of it. Auto dealers being another one. But again, those are better funded, larger organizations, right. and their group of advisors are such that they're going to be on top of this maybe a little bit more than smaller groups. Which again goes back to why are loans smaller in the second round versus first round. A lot of the bigger companies acted a little more quickly. They were teed up for that by their advisors.
And the question I had, Bill, isn't, as you might suspect, the question I had isn't far flung. Back in the early 30s, when we were going through another bad time, it was the small arts businesses, believe it or not, the home businesses, those types of businesses were the things that brought families money because they had to go out and try to do something like the arts and crafts fair that they have up in Sunapee every year. That was actually started back in the 30s, but it gave people an opportunity to sell small products. It gave local artists, bands and things like that a chance to make money. I don't think, again, my perspective, I don't think some of those organizations are taking advantage of, and maybe they can't, of this PPP.
So part of it would be if they're a business that is run to not necessarily show a profit, they wouldn't qualify.
There you go.
And I'm not talking about a nonprofit. I'm talking about someone that we had somebody that came to us last week, and their company is basically a net zero P&L. Their choice.
Yep. Well,
that doesn't help them today, because of how they look at it. You have to take, if you're a sole proprietor, if you're a company with a payroll, it's easy. You take the payroll calcs and you apply a formula to it, and that includes your health insurance. That's easy. But if you are a chiropractor by yourself, a massage therapist by yourself, they look at the P&L at the end of the year, and you take the profit at the end of the year, assuming there's a profit, divide it by 12, multiply by 2.5, and that's the formula. If you didn't have a profit or a minimal profit, PPP doesn't work for you because of that basis.
Bill, as we wind up here, is there any advice that you can give, any greater advice? Because I feel that this has been a very good program, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to explain and to encourage folks to take advantage of this. Is there any other advice you would give some of our smaller businesses, New Hampshire businesses, Bedford businesses, to take advantage of this program?
If you haven't taken advantage of it, I would talk to your bank about taking advantage of it. So I think that is important. And if you're around one recipient, please stay tuned, because you very well may be entitled and eligible to receiving another round of PPP money. Additionally, if the economy doesn't get better, and we have a wave, as you talk about, a second wave, that's a possibility, everybody may be eligible for more PPP. So I would say that if you're a recipient, pay attention. Talk to your bank, talk to your advisors. If you are around one recipient, pay really close attention. And if you've never gotten PPP money, you really, really, really want to pay attention and reach out, because the money is there for you and there's no rush on it. There's a lot of money that's available for those that qualify and they need it. And that's, to your point, Dave, it was a well thought out program, and it's there for a purpose, and people should take advantage of that purpose, because it's still uncertain times out there.
Bill, thanks very much again for participating in this conversation with the Longview. And thanks again for all that you're doing behind the scenes to help the folks in Bedford, the businesses in Bedford, but ultimately the employees in Bedford too. So thank you very much for that. And I thank you for just participating in the show today. And I wish you a good summer.
Thanks, Dave. You too.
Good fishing, I think, is what I'd say.
If I could get over the border, I'd be in really good shape. I can't get over the border right now.
Thanks, Bill. And I hope you'll join us again. The next rendition we have of the Longview, we'll keep you posted. Bill, I hope you'll stay with us as we go along on this program regarding the PPP. And hopefully, as the economy starts to pick up, we can get some better views as to what's going on. Thank you very much for participating with us today. And Bill, thank you again.
You're welcome.
This is Dave Danielson, and this has been the Longview.